Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, we're going to have a great webinar with our own Sam Curry and then Ed Amoroso of Tag Cyber. We're going to be discussing building an all-encompassing endpoint protection platform in today's market. So without further ado, I'm just going to kick it off to our host for an intro.
So I think we're going to start with Ed. This is Sam Curry speaking. Ed, welcome to the webinar. Maybe you could say a few words about yourself and your background.
Well, thanks, Sam. It's great to be here. So I've been doing cybersecurity probably for longer than many of the people listening have been alive. I guess I'm getting old. But I spent 31 years over at AT&T, first half in Bell Labs doing cybersecurity. Then we called it computer and network security. And then the second half, I assumed the role that we would describe as CISO in the beginning. We weren't quite sure what to call it. Retired a couple of years ago to get into the research and advisory business, so that's Tag Cyber. We push out a lot of advisory material that I hope listeners will download and enjoy. And as you know, I've been an academic for 30 years as well, teach over at NYU and Stevens, and I have a advisory role over at Johns Hopkins at the Applied Physics Lab. So those are all the different things that I do. And Sam, you and I have known each other a long time, and I appreciate you inviting me to participate today.
My pleasure, Ed. It's always fun to do things together, and you're right. A few different points in our career, we have crossed paths and done stuff. So my sincere hope is that today is a fun webinar for those who are listening. My name is Sam Curry. I've been in security for almost 30 years, and always with various security companies. I've held a variety of roles. I'm a 4-time CISO now, but I've also been a chief technology officer. Involved in academia, done obviously development and research, and run product organizations for some big brands over the years. You can check it out on LinkedIn. But perhaps most significantly, this will be my 7th time in the endpoint game in some way, shape, or form with an antivirus product and or personal firewalls and or EDR, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully we will have fun with this subject because the market's been around for a long time, Ed, and we've often talked about its evolution. So hopefully we can give good background and give people some guidance on how to approach getting to this notion of a harmonized endpoint strategy. So with that, this is the agenda. We're going to start with, of course, an introduction, but then a short history of EPP, as Gartner calls it, the endpoint platform, or endpoint protection. Other names include ESS. Forrester, for instance, calls it the Endpoint Security Suite. And then I think we can't really have a conversation without talking about the pyramid of pain at least a little bit, some timeline of what's happened on the bad guys' side with malware adoption, and a timeline of what we've done in defense, and then understanding antivirus in particular, and some closing points and questions. So I think the format we're going to use, Ed, is if you're comfortable with it, I'm in control of the slides and we'll advance them. Please feel free to jump in, but I'll probably call on you for your insights from the seats that you've held over the years, if that's all right.
That sounds good. I'll make sure I pay close attention so you don't call me and I don't have the answer. That'd be bad.
Oh, and if you mute in between, don't forget to unmute. Yeah. So first thing I'm going to start with, though, is the pyramid of pain. Some of you have probably seen this over the years. And the best way that I can ground this, and we'll look at the history of some of the terminology here, is this is acting on known bad. Having seen something before that's negative, how do we then, we know it's bad, we're going from the micro to the macro. In the moment, how do you decide whether to allow something or not? And of course, the most obvious thing here is hashing, which is actual signatures for files or applications or processes or what have you. And saying, okay, so I've got an actual signature. These are relatively trivial to harvest. We do them at scale now. But as you move up this pyramid, of course, it gets harder to do, it gets harder to apply, and it has more value as well. And so we go to things like IP addresses and domain names, but now we're getting up above into the more advanced toolkits. So we get into what are the network and host artifacts around it, more advanced attacks, what are the tools that they deploy or use, and what are the tactics and techniques and practices that are that the opponents engage in. And of course, this is the harder thing to do at the top. It has the most longevity. It has the most applicability, but it's the hardest thing to harvest and gives the most value. And I think understanding this pyramid is a basis for moving on, but it's taken us a while to get more and more to the top. And those things at the bottom of this pyramid are largely commodities, while at the top, of course. If you can find ways to search for these things in your network or in your systems, then you've got the best chance of actually finding bad guys. Any thoughts on the classic pyramid of pain, Ed?
No question. And you know, Sam, I've seen this pyramid a few times. I've seen it pop up. And one thing that I often counsel in using this chart is that where those those little Batman call outs on the rough, like bam, boom, tough, challenging. A complement to that would be that up at the top, there's pretty good gain when you're dealing with TTPs, whereas down in terms of hash, perhaps the return is a little bit less. So while hash value might be somewhat trivial to harvest, the irony is that the return is not so good. So it's almost like the words get a little bit more difficult as you go up along the right side of the pyramid. You could almost envision on the left side that as you go up, the return to the threat hunting increases. So that's why you do travel up that pyramid, because you get a lot more out of the more the richer sources of telemetry and data. So that would be my thought on this. But it's a good
totally
way.
Right.
It does help. Yeah.
Totally right. And of course, we have massive industries for sharing feeds down at the bottom, especially the bottom three. If somebody says, I've been attacked, I've got an advanced attacker, they say, share your IOCs. They're usually referring to these three. And they're the easiest to then go and run and say, do I have it or not? But, we saw, you and I spoke about this recently, Operation Soft Cell, drops of a piece of malware, something like Poison Ivy as a remote access Trojan, had unique signatures at each drop in the same kill chain. So the value of these to be shared is minimal, to say the least. So let's take a look quick. Go ahead.
Before you leave that last chart, I think that you made a good point. A lot of times we talk about threat intelligence and the kinds of things, for example, that you might be requesting from government. And it's always those three bottom things. I know you and I've discussed this before, like when you connect up with a government agency and they want to share something, and it's always a bunch of IP addresses, domain names, hash, that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's spectacularly useful, admittedly, but oftentimes it's not. And I like the fact that in this chart, it's the stuff on the top that really impresses when you get it, right? If somebody's sharing, artifacts about servers and systems, or they're giving you access to tools that have been used to compromise, or really showing you the step-by-step procedural activity that's being done, what's the strategy in an attack, that's awesome. So I think if you draw a line between the three bottom ones and the three top, and you put underneath that line, you say, hey, this is the usual sort of threat intelligence that you see flying around the internet, sometimes even space junk. But the stuff on the top, that's very useful. You need it all. You need everything. You can't build a pyramid without the bottom parts. But I love how, in a sense, it kind of shows that all of these things play a role, and it does just sort of jump off the page that the bottom three are very commonly cited in threat intelligence. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought that was...
No, you're spot on. And above that line that we've driven through the middle here, above that line typically requires more depth of expertise and, should we say, more carbon-based intelligence to go find stuff, right? You have to know what to look for when you get a TTP and how to recognize it as it could be, this is a behavior, this is how the naming conventions work, this is where drops how they tend to be set up, this is what people do within the system, it might be idiosyncratic, and that isn't something you just sort of plug literally a feed into something and run a check, right? It gets harder as part of more human interface as well.
Good summary.
So let's take a look at a timeline of malware adoption. You'll find some conflicting histories of this, and some of the academics who are listening probably could do a wonderful job with some early anecdotes or descriptions. But pretty much if you go back about 40, 50 years, we're talking dozens to hundreds of viruses. And then there's this exponential increase. And I remember, in the 90s, seeing what the number of malware samples analyzed per day and per year was, and watching it continue to grow exponentially. We, of course, saw viruses turn into things like worms, but also we saw the advent of botnets and mega breaches. And if you look at 2001, I used to call this back then publicly hybrid threats. Symantec, who were my big competition in those days, called them blended threats, which I thought sounded like a Starbucks drink, but a lot of people used the term. And we had the year of the worm, advent of spyware and adware, and the question of what is this grayware stuff. The year of the rootkit we saw, and rootkits were even being used commercially in some cases because we hadn't figured out the rules on when we had the term pup came up. Personally, a potentially unwanted program, which always felt a bit weaselly, something either is or isn't wanted. And there were debates about how do we define adware, spyware, and pups. And then the mega breaches got, of course, much, much bigger. And then that continued. If you look at it from a slightly different perspective, you look at sort of how did EPP adoption parallel that. The first antivirus was very simple. And then we saw new tools emerging in the 2000s. Things like personal firewalls came out and HIPs came out. Some of the first next-gen antivirus and whitelisting-based products came out in the early 2000s. And then to parallel the year of the rootkit, right afterwards, we started to see the early EDRs. UEBA became a tool that people talked about, and new types of tools were released, especially exploit prevention and using some deceptive practices in defense. Ed, if we either look at the previous slide around malware adoption, and then I'll move back to the next one on what we did on the good side. Any thoughts of what you saw over the course of your career as the tools on the dark side increased and became more prolific?
Well, it's a little depressing, isn't it? Because you do
we don't
see
want
one thing after another. Like between 2006 and 2010, somewhere in there, we started talking about APTs, and that's pretty depressing stuff, right? That's where you went from like one thing that's not shown on the chart here. But these are really good charts. I think for people watching, I hope you'll look carefully, because these will make good ways to train your own executive team on the journey we've been on. But one thing that's not shown is that the people writing these viruses on the left side of this page were mostly people who were experimentalists, probably not trying to bring down planet Earth or take over a government. You know what I mean? It was.
We actually had the rules of engagement then, right? And we used to have this.
It was different. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, you could argue, is it malicious? Yeah, you shouldn't be writing software that's going to go, eat up somebody's machine. But for the most part, it wasn't so malicious. But you go to the right side of this and you attach names, faces, groups, organizations, countries to where these things come from. And Sam, you and I know, I'm sure a lot of people listening know, it isn't kids and small groups, just experimenting. These are done for reasons that are not so good, that are trying to produce some consequence that in the worst case might actually kill some people. So it's not sort of evident in the chart, but on the left, foolishness of youth, kids, hackers, things like that. On the right, military-funded groups sometimes that are doing things to cause real damage. So that's what I mean when I say it's a little depressing, because you think, have we made much progress? Certainly in some areas we've made progress, but it's time now that we pull it together and change what this malware adoption timeline looks like for the next 30 years. Yeah,
and I hear the note in your voice when you say it's depressing. The most depressing for me is probably this slide, right? The second one, because the techniques have only occasionally had big leaps forward. I fully expect that as we become more digital in our daily lives and the blurred line between the digital and the physical gets blurrier, I fully expect to see people saying, well, I can accomplish all my real world ends by going online. It's not a surprise that, APTs emerge and nation states are now doing everything from hacking the Olympics to hacking elections. And it's no surprise that organized crime moves online. But it's kind of depressing for me when there isn't enough in defense changing the equation. So I look here, and antivirus was the first on the scene, and it's sort of, as we'll talk in a moment, accumulated other products around it. But by and large, I hate sitting in audiences and hearing, as a CISO, that there are those who've been breached and those that don't know it. And for me, that's the most depressing thing. Any thoughts on your part about the evolution of the defenses?
Well, I mean, one thing that's sort of not shown here, well, there's two things. One is that I think that the underlying operating system software has gotten better, right? I mean, it's probably indisputable that, you know, the kind of software that we were buying in the 80s and 90s for what we were calling endpoints then was pretty crappy, you know, and we all watched kind of Microsoft take the brunt of people like you and I kind of beating them up, saying, you know, it's not acceptable to have to patch every month and have all these problems. So it's gotten better, but that's been balanced by a more targeted and more intense threat. So, and certainly more adoption. Like, you know, I'm sure there's people listening who look on the left side of this this chart and think, yeah, well, everybody, you know, had PCs in the 80s and 90s. Well, they sure didn't. Not everybody had PCs in the 80s and 90s. I bought a Mac in 1984. I was the first personal computer. I mean, I had little single boards, but just saying that the adoption on the left was a lot smaller. Now it's massive. So operating system software has gotten better, but that's balanced by the more intense use of endpoints, particularly by people who are not real good operators. So I think maybe those two things balance out, and you know, and you have the chart that you've got here, which I think is very accurate. This does look like it carries many of the real important advances that we've seen over the last 30 years.
Yeah, it's sort of like, it must be like looking at highway crash statistics. Yes, the cars are safer now, but people still die on the roads, and that there hasn't been enough advancement, right? And we'll stay away from autonomous vehicles just in the interest of time, but I thought it might be interesting as well to look at how things have changed. Looking at Gartner, back in 2005, Neil McDonald and company from Gartner produced a paper called The 9 Protection Styles of Host-Based Intrusion Prevention. And in 2016, they came up with a different way, and this should actually say 5 styles of advanced threat defense. So they originally broke down the first as a grid. It was like a tic-tac-toe, 3 by 3, and said the columns in the tic-tac-toe were block known bad, allow known good, and behavioral. And then they said, where do you do it? The rows going from bottom to top were network, operating system, and application, and behavioral. And so it was kind of like you could almost plot where the technologies were falling, and antivirus was dominant. Later, they then changed it. They simplified it. They said real-time versus post-compromise as the columns, and they said endpoint, payload, network. So they kind of simplified a grid, and the desire was Gartner to define in a Cartesian way how defense was done, and then to try to carve it up, and it wound up simplifying in many ways. I'd say the current state of antivirus today, unfortunately, I believe most antivirus companies, or what they've turned into, let's call it EPP, I put Antivirus Plus here, is that they compete with each other for the most part, not with adversaries. Also, they have been largely commoditized. You can get them everywhere, and the quality is the same everywhere for recognizing the known bad, the lower 3 of the pyramid of pain. And for some reason, cost isn't going down for these as we would expect it to. When something's a commodity, price usually goes down, and yet that's not what's happening. Ed, this again probably sounds pretty depressing to you, but as the current state of antivirus, does this jive with you? Is this how you see the core technology that's been around the longest, and is at the center of EPP?
Yeah, there's no question. I like how you have Antivirus Plus, right? Because really, the tools are better. There's no question. And you know, this idea that you're in the early days, these were static defenses, right? Where you had a whole pile of signatures, you ran through, you did basically a whitelist, and you determined whether or not there was an issue. It's gotten better. So Antivirus Plus is right. I don't want to beat up the industry too much, because I do think people should continue to depend on and use a decent antivirus tool to the degree that it makes sense in the architecture. But by the same token, these are not great observations that you've got here in the boxes, and they are true. So this is not something you would pre-program as, gosh, I hope we'll get commoditized, and I hope our cost doesn't go in. We'll not go down. You would not ask for that as your story. So
agreed.
Yeah, you got to do something else. Hence, our topic today. I mean, this is, it's certainly the case that I'm sure everybody listening knows you have to do more than just run some AV. But by the same token, again, a lot of smart people put a lot of time in. It is better, but it's not enough. I think everyone would agree with that.
Yeah, I having been in this specific space for a long time, none of us set out to create a commodity, right? It was not, your point's right. Nobody wanted this end game yet. I think the answer to that question, why the cost of antivirus isn't going down, is the one main one is that the brand value for a lot of the companies that sell it is greater than the actual, call it cyber value. Yes, I would never throw out my antivirus. I absolutely need it in my environment. I think that's true of every CISO, but I don't look to it as my primary way to stop attackers anymore. And the second reason is, I call this hungry hippos sometimes. Historically, the companies that got big, I remember I was at McAfee, right? It was McAfee and Symantec races to $1 billion, right around the 99, 2000 mark. When they got there, in order to avoid commoditization pressure, they started to buy up the stuff around them, what Gartner in its 9 styles or its later 5 styles had as adjacencies to antivirus. These were the big companies that had the P&L strength to buy up the adjacent products and suck it in. So you added more value by pulling in this list of other products that weren't as market present. And they became suites of tools. So this is antivirus glommed on around it, the things that were adjacent technologically, to bolster its own value and avoid commoditization, and used brand to have a perception of value. And that's what led to the EPP, or choose your acronym. I would argue, by the way, that EDR grew so quickly, so fast, that they couldn't just hungry hippo it. They couldn't just suck it in. Yes, there's a convergence going on, but you now see the classic EPP market on the defensive side being disrupted to some degree. Ed, does that resonate with you?
It does, and you might add IDS, and perhaps even IPS to that firewall. But these are all there. It looks like the ingredients on the side of the box for most of the tools that I'll bet a lot of people on this call are running. And yeah, you need all this stuff. And, it's a shame that that in many cases, these things are not well integrated. So again, if you're looking at this, if you're listening, you're looking at this chart and you're on either an endpoint team, then where you are right now, I would guess, at least based on my research, is figuring out how to integrate. Like everybody I talk to, they understand what these things are. They probably list out a bunch of vendors they work with in these areas. And they say, well, where are you? And they scratch their head and say, I'm trying to make all this stuff work together, trying to integrate, trying to find something that is a little bit less haphazard and willy-nilly all over the place. Sam, that's been my observation, in my research and my working with many different teams. That's where they are figuring out what do I do now? I've got all this stuff all over the place. Is that consistent with your thoughts, Sam?
Oh, absolutely. It's and in fact, I would say that it goes beyond this. Like the other question for me is, so why hasn't antivirus been able to innovate at a fast enough rate itself? So if we just that earlier when I said the brand value was greater than cyber value, why didn't the cyber value increase? And I think most of the antivirus industry has been staring at itself. The competition was seen as the enemy. We had races to see who caught the bad guy least badly, right? With the notion of a wild list means that all the samples that are being tested against are all 3 to 5 weeks old or older. And that's not a good measure of what people are doing today. And this notion of an intelligent adaptive opponent is a critical one. On the next slide, I spell it out a little differently, but this is actually a human being. This is not machine-to-machine conflict. It's human-to-human conflict using machines, at least at the moment. And of course, I think the pyramid of pain, tapping into the known bad, is defeatist, to say the least. It's the wrong telemetry. In other words, there might be other telemetry that we could act off of and other ways of looking at data and saying, where is the needle in the haystack? Ed, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, these all look right. No, these are the right things. That middle one, it certainly jumps off the page. You're dealing with, I mean, look, if you're a military cybersecurity team doing offense, then you buy all the AV products, you buy the commercial tools, and you stick them in the lab. I mean, we all know that. Again, for the people listening, if your executive team asks you, why do these static defenses not work? You can remind them that the bad guys can have access to many of the same tools. That's why behavioral analysis is so useful, because it's more dynamic. If it's a static kind of defense, then I can set it up in the lab and learn to dance around it. If it's a little bit more dynamic and adaptive, that's better, because as you can see here, your opponent is adaptive. So, well, you better have a platform that can adapt.
And, maybe the other way to characterize it, I think you liked to this point on the previous slide, is first order chaos is when your opponent is natural. It may adapt, but it's not adapting intelligently. And it's important to remember most of the cyber risk, which is why I refer to cyber value as a unique thing, is about second order risk, second order chaos, which is when there's a human opponent or a human level intelligence opposing you. Humans are the most brilliant and adaptive thing that we've ever encountered. And they're trying to come into our networks. And it's important to remember that they're behind the tools, as opposed to thinking of it as just, hey, there's an anonymous and just viruses. Once they're released, they're just going to iterate and do their thing. Same thing with worms. The really insidious threat is when a human being is orchestrating their behavior or selecting among tools what to use in any given situation.
Yeah, it's a good model. Is dealing with your board of directors, is that third order chaos? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
That's brilliant.
No, I think that this is a good model. I like these two.
All right. So let's talk a little bit as well about addressing more than I would characterize, by the way, most prevention, not all, but most, especially EPP classic tools, as addressing the first and the last stage in the MITRE attack framework. And I did a very unusual thing on this slide. I put the first half of the attack framework on the top and the second half on the bottom. It's really just one contiguous line. So it is going from left to right. It should go initial access all the way to defense evasion and then credential access all the way to impact. And I put this arrow going backwards. It's our job to catch it between the beginning and the end. Most prevention is at the beginning. Initial access execution is where antivirus plays in its cohort. It's hungry hippos, and firewalls and exfil stuff at the end around exfiltration and to some degree command and control. It's the middle stages, and Hollywood has done us quite a disservice in that most movies you see a hacker typing and hitting enter and saying, I'm done, implying that it's like from the moment you get that initial access, it's game over. And really, the big innovation around detection is unpeeling the steps in between initial access and especially exfiltration, that second to last step. And our goal is, in fact, to more reliably and predictably catch things with less noise, more to the left in this, and to be able to handle and deal with all of the stages in between. So to your point about behavior, Ed, which is spot on, it's the behaviors of the bad guys. It's the TTPs from the top of that pyramid of pain that we need to become more systematic in recording and then identifying and finding. And I would characterize that as detection as opposed to classic prevention. Does that resonate?
Yeah, it does. And for people listening, classically, the idea of being to the right of this MITRE attack list involves waiting until something bad happens, like some incident. But it is also possible to do the types of things you have on the right here with from MITRE for indicators instead of incidents. So while I totally agree, you should certainly be moving to the left. I mean, who doesn't want to prevent? You'd like to do that. Another sort of complementary way of thinking of the whole litany here, again, still moving to the left if you can, is that you can turn the squelch or point the squelch on telemetry and indications. And that's what, when you're managing a threat hunt team, that's part of the coaching that you give the team. That, again, depending on the industry that you're in, if you're in a highly regulated industry, say power or banking or something, then you focus in on every little thing and you respond to indicators. And that's good, because if you go through the whole process, then you've prevented something. So it becomes a life cycle in the small that is sort of a preventive action in the large. So there's so many different ways of looking at these methodologies. I'm glad you showed it here, and I love the dotted line. I think that tells a nice story of what you would like to do.
Yeah, I only wish it would fit in one line.
Looks like it works okay here.
And I also like the notion that you had of this iteration between the two. Here, the way we tried to describe it was the detection feeds prevention, meaning if you do that in between the boundaries piece correctly, you should only be detecting once, and they should be getting more efficient at prevention. And prevention colors detection. When you find a behavior, where you know things can bring this notion of bringing color to the activity. When you're hunting, when you're investigating, when you're trying to resolve and get business context, when you're actually running cyber operations, prevention should color detection. It's not going to do the job for you, but it should bring context to you. And so we tried to describe it with a little greater than sign in the middle, that if you do this harmonized detection and prevention together, that they're worth more than the sum of the parts. You know, for I think the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen EPP companies go, what is this detection stuff? Is it real? EPPs, we know. And EDR companies and other forms of detection, especially things like network detection, have said, nah, EPP is dead. It's all about detection. And the answer is actually no, and it's not just the sum of the two. If you do the two right in an integrated and harmonized way, it's actually worth more than the two separately. And I would call that defense in depth done right. As you know, Ed, DID was the excuse of the failed security company for years, that you should naturally have 5 layers. And if my layer failed, well, that's not my fault. I think DID done correctly says we're going to optimize and get efficiencies by working together. Every layer should complement the other layers and not just be redundant. What's your take here, Ed?
No, it's a good way of looking at it, the circular nature there. I'm going to print this out and make a little patch to put on my jacket here. I like the
I like that.
So, yeah, it's good.
We should make these patches available to anyone on the webinar at some point. I don't have them. I'll get in trouble, no doubt, with my marketing folks. But so if we look, one question is now: should you put all your eggs in one basket, in the EDR basket? I think we kind of answered that on the previous slide. No, don't put all your eggs in any basket, and instead, this notion of harmonized DPP is I think the way to go. So I know we're approaching the end of our time here, and I want to leave some time for questions. So. Ed, I think the bottom line from our conversations were these 3 points. You should prevent the preventable. You should have a full decision loop to get things as much to the left of bang, as much to the left of that moment of exfiltration as possible. And obviously deal with the right of bang priorities and mitigation, especially around availability. But a harmonized DPP is greater than the sum of the parts. If you get the EDR right and it is feeding into prevention as it learns, and I mean people and processes and tools. And if you get the prevention piece adding color and context without noise to detection, then I think you're headed in the right direction. Any final thoughts or comments before we go to questions?
No, these are good thoughts. I like the notion of harmonizing the endpoint protections. You know, I'd use the word integration. That's probably more gearhead term. Harmonize sounds better, but making things work together is a theme that I'd recommend people listening really write down on the paper and make a priority for 2020. How can you take all these tools and systems from companies like CyberReason? You know, how do you integrate them, make them work together, orchestrate them, harmonize? These are the verbs that I think should describe people's plans for 2020. Now's the time, right, Sam? This is when you start going to your boss and saying, all right, here's what I'm going to do in 2020. That's what you do in November, and then you lay it all out. So as people think that through, those would be the kinds of activities I'd recommend.
Yeah, and I would also not accept the old integrated means a syslog feed to the SIM. Not good enough. Effectively, it has to improve the processes that you're trying to achieve, right? So prevention should be at machine speeds and as effective as it can be, and you should have this mindset that things are going to get past it. How do you, in fact, get really, really good at finding those things early and fast and getting the waste out of that system? And that's usually use case driven, right? It's processes, it's putting the analysts in the middle when there are analysts or human beings in the loop. Because we do have intelligence and security, it's just carbon-based, and the silicon-based intelligence and the integrations and the neat things we want the products to do with each other should be in service to that automation and efficiency improvements. So I'm going to pass it back at this point and say, are there any questions from the audience? Oh, I've just been handed a few here that have come from the webinar. Ed, the first one is, what is the minimum that a security team needs to implement if they have a tight budget for EPP? So Ed, any thoughts there on the minimum that a team needs to implement if they're worried about the pennies?
Well, first off, I think everyone has a tight budget. So whether you're a monster bank or a little regional bank or a small business, you shouldn't be wasting money, under any set of circumstances. So the first thing I would say is that the advice would be the same for everyone. You want to match up the threat that exists to your protections. I think there's a movement in our industry to be a little bit more cognizant of threat. So look, if you're a small company but you're doing something spectacularly consequential, then your endpoint strategy is going to have to reflect that increased threat. But let's say you're a team of artists, you may be able to get away with something a little bit more light. I mean, in the dream scenario is that these kinds of things become embedded in the day-to-day work activities where threat intelligence is done and cloud on the back, in the back office is taking care of a lot of different things for you. Things are managed, they're auto done. Like I thought Microsoft's auto update changed the industry for a lot of people, and the reason is because you don't have to do anything. So again, my advice would be just don't forget to look at the threat that you're dealing with, because different businesses have different consequence models. Different businesses have different nightmare scenarios that they deal with. And it's hard to just say, well, because you have a small budget, do this. If you have a higher budget, do that, because the circumstances of your business really do play into that decision. Does that make sense, Sam?
Yeah, it does. And in fact, I'm leery of anything that's like, oh yeah, go buy it because it's a checklist. It smacks of the compliance days forcing us to do things. The biggest problem in security is probably, surprise, surprise, not this. It's the lack of alignment between security and the business. And by that, I mean, not that they can't get funds for a project or two. It's that the CFO expects security to be asking for the latest toys because of latest threats. And it's hard for the business to say, do I hire another marketing or salesperson, another engineer, another QA person, or do I invest in a new product or person in the security department? And without engaging in a dialogue, and I'm not saying you have to become a deep technical expert in every domain of security, but getting security on the same table using the same language as other things means you can say, here's the risks if we do or don't do something. And I would also be leery of anything that is just install it and we'll take care of it for you. Chances are at that point, you're really just buying a suite that isn't going to do very much to reduce the actual risk as we showed it between initial compromise and exfil. Let's move on to one more question. And Ed, I'm fascinated to hear what you think. This one, what does the future of EPP look like? Where do you think it's headed, Ed?
Well, a few different directions. First, let's all agree that the history that you showed is one that involves a lot of different threads and a lot of different decisions for CISO teams around what to do in the endpoint. Like you listed a bunch of them, but there's more, right? There's digital forensics. Some people call that endpoint protections. If you and I were sitting long enough with enough beer, I bet we'd come up with 20 different threads, in terms of EPP. I hope that the future is one of convergence. Like that would be my dream for this area, that you don't have to go buy the steering wheel, the wheels, the engine, the roof, the seats, in order to put the car together. And I know that's something that you guys at Cybereason have told me about. I know that's an important priority. You know, I don't mean to say that just to sort of promote what you're doing, but I know that that's important. So my hope for the future would be a simpler procurement and selection model, higher degrees of integration and convergence of all these crazy threads, so you don't have, you know, 10 endpoint security vendors. That's always struck me as crazy, and I hope that fixes itself.
Yeah, I like that. I like that answer a lot. I think the only thing that I would add is my sincere hope is that the future becomes commoditized. A commodity is when we actually get to the point where we don't need to have crazy innovation, that we get to a place where it becomes a manageable risk and the defenders enjoy the expectation of victory. Because right now, cyber conflict means that we do sit in audiences and hear things like, there's those who've been hacked and those who don't know it. And I think we're going to see a wave of hype. There's a no end of startups at the middle in the product, in the market, by the way. I think we're going to see some deceptive technologies come out and a lot of hyperbole and excessive claims. We saw it with machine learning and artificial intelligence and all the other buzzwords. In the end, though, I'm just hoping the results are there, and I'm hoping we get to the point where we think of processes and people and tools and make us more efficient in what we're doing, and that a lot of this just becomes a commodity over time. I don't think that will happen because the bad guys are innovating so quickly, and a lot of people have good ideas to try, but a lot of those good ideas have to have a chance to fail before they go into some really big environments. So with that, I'd like to thank folks. And Ed, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for doing this with me. It's great to work with you again. And hopefully we get a chance to do it again sometime.
Very good. I appreciate it. And I hope people enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you all.